really inspired this was I was listening to this podcast called The Last Days of August, which was following this very tragic story of this adult film star, August Ames, who had a very mysterious death. They kept throwing around these different statistics related to folks dying very young in this industry, many of them before 25 or 26. One, this is a really interesting data story here. And two, I can guarantee you no one else is writing about this. And no one would do this in a job interview, which I found out by doing this in a job interview that there's a reason. You maybe should steer clear of controversial topics before you work somewhere. Yeah, I think that might have been the first interview someone had to start an HR file on someone who didn't even work there.
Today, I had the pleasure of interviewing Zach Quinn. Zach is a data engineer and writer with a master's degree in data science and an undergraduate degree in journalism. During his admittedly short broadcast media career, Zach worked in radio, television, and digital media. At age 20, he worked as a producer for his favorite morning radio show in Baltimore, which he left abruptly after getting an opportunity to intern at The Tonight Show. Following The Tonight Show, Zach went on to Orlando, Florida, where he worked at Disney World while the company paid for his data science master's. Shortly after graduation, Forbes hired Zach as a data engineer, and he works remotely full-time. In his spare time, Zach writes about data, tech, and remote work on his Medium blog Pipeline. He's also a co-editor of the Learning SQL publication, where he and his co-editors helped it rank as a top 5 publication for the SQL tag. Currently, he lives in Orlando with his wife and the pets that interrupt all of his Zoom meetings. Zach and I had an amazing conversation about the importance of writing in data science, how he leverages the skills that he learned from journalism in his current work, and his highly unorthodox projects. You don't want to miss those. I really enjoyed talking with Zach. I hope you enjoy this episode as well. So Zach, welcome to the Ken's Nearest Neighbors podcast. Thanks for coming on.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
No problem. Well, I found out about you from your project work, from your work on Medium, and you did such interesting stuff there. I thought it was going to be really exciting to have you come on and sort of talk about your journey. I mean, it's relatively unorthodox for someone working in the data space. So I'm sure there'll be a lot of people that are interested in hearing how you went from more of a journalism background into this data domain.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's definitely one of the more unconventional paths I've seen. I think on LinkedIn the other day, I saw somebody who went from hospitality to kind of a data analyst, data engineer role. So it does happen, going from more of a liberal arts or non-computer science background into this field, especially because of how many resources exist now for teaching and empowering people to learn not only data skills, but programming and math and business, everything you need for this kind of role. So it might sound weird on the surface to say I came from journalism and media primarily. But I think when you look at it in that context of just seeing how many resources and how you can kind of take advantage of that these days, it kind of makes sense that I was one of really many people who have been able to shift from some sort of field into data or into tech. I think it's getting more common to go from something kind of obscure to data science.
Amazing. Well, I think in that vein, I'm really interested in where did you first get excited about data? What was your first exposure to data? Was there something that you saw or something that you did that flipped a switch that said, wow, this is a profession that I'm interested in? Or was it more of this slow progression over time from maybe more of the journalism side?
Yeah, I mean, the moment I kind of pinpoint not just discovering data science as a role, but more discovering the power of what data can do, both in a good sense and bad sense, was, I would say probably around 2016, 2017, with the election, because I was doing more journalistic coverage then, and I was in journalism school, and I watched the documentary on Netflix. It's great. It's called The Great Hack, which I think may have come out slightly after 2016. I don't know if I have that year right, But around that time, we were kind of learning about what was happening with Cambridge Analytica and with these folks who were able to do this like dark arts version of data science. I thought it was interesting at the time, and it didn't occur to me really until I had an opportunity down the road to go back to school and get a master's degree, that I decided to go with data science ultimately.
Well, I think that that's a pretty salient example of how journalism and data are very similar. You know, I've heard the exact same thing said about any type of machine learning model, is that any of the models, or more the data that we use, it does include some sort of bias. And our responsibility as data scientists, or even as like journalists, is to understand where our data is biased and hopefully either make some considerations for that or make people aware of that. Which is, you know, a kind of an early signal that journalism and data science have quite a lot in common when we really dig into it.
I think also to that point, it's interesting because like I think there's maybe not enough acknowledgement or discussion about ethics in any kind of data science program, especially none affiliated with university. I mean, they're great like one-off programs like Udemy
or their electives at university.
Yeah, it's weird. It's like kind of pushed to the side. Whereas in journalism school, I had a whole course dedicated to ethics, and we had like literally an ethics handbook that we signed to acknowledge we would abide by certain standards, even as student reporters. But in data, it's still very ambiguous, like how people should be using data, and not just the data scientists or engineers or analysts, but the data consumers within the organization, outside of the organization. There are so many like ways that people can just make sure they're being careful of using data and like actually following privacy laws and just treating data with like the sensitivity and respect that, you know, you'd probably want someone to treat your personal data with.
Yeah, I agree. You know, something that I think might make that more complicated is that data privacy laws, the way that individuals or companies consume data, it varies pretty aggressively country to country. And I'm interested, I don't actually know anything about this. Is journalism something similar, or there's like this sort of broad journalistic ethic that we use kind of uniformly across the world comparatively?
Yeah, I mean, there's no like, I mean, journalism's not like law or medicine where you have to like pass an exam and get recertified. I mean, anyone can call themselves a reporter or journalist theoretically. There are broader organizations. I'm thinking of like the Associated Press and some other maybe international organizations that promote collaboration and obviously working to a certain standard, but like data, there's no like Hippocratic oath or anything for people to fall back on and say like this is definitely how you were supposed to do this thing. It's still up to the individual.
Interesting. And again, like another very interesting ethical parallel. And I would hope that data does start to put into place or like this domain a more clear outline or a more evolving outline about right and wrong. I think that that's something that is increasingly challenging the more data that we have. I actually taught a course called Designing Ethical AI Systems, and it was very difficult because there's no possible way for legislation or individual organizations to keep up with the pace of change that we see in AI or that we see in any of the models that we use in the scale of data that we have. And so it's like this weird recurring problem where you have to either create fundamental laws that are scalable, or you have to continually put band-aids on things as they come about, which is very, very difficult to do.
I mean, I think you're kind of seeing that now too. I mean, I don't think this year, I think a couple of weeks ago, so technically last year, 2022, you had various governments and regulatory bodies slapping some pretty massive fines on companies for what they are saying are infringements. Like Sephora got hit with, I think, like $1 million fine. Meta got hit with a larger, like $400 million fine. And then Google, I think they're fighting like a $4 billion like infringement case in the EU for violating aspects of the GDPR, which is the EU's governing like privacy, I guess like guidelines or law. So that stuff is starting to happen, which I think is a pretty good thing because it's definitely forcing companies to look inward and make sure that not only is the organization like being held to this standard, but that everyone within the organization is properly trained and equipped to recognize, personally identifiable information, PII, where that comes up, how to treat it, and again, just like making sure you're treating people's data with respect, like it would be your own data. And then of course, like in the US, I think we only have like 4 state laws right now. I mean, you would probably know more about that than me, but it's really patchwork at the moment. It's really just like California and
I know California's a big one.
Yeah, I think Virginia just came out with one. It's like it's really weird, like how they're kind of popping up, like almost like a franchise restaurant or something. I don't know. It's just like, yeah.
That is an interesting way to describe it. I recently released the course that I wish I had had when I was starting out in the data science domain. It's called The Machine Learning Process from A to Z, and I partnered with 365 Data Science to build this. I also worked with my good friend Jeff Lee, who's one of the most impressive data scientists I know, to get all of the implementation correct. This course is special for a couple reasons. So first, it focuses on the machine learning process. So you go from ideation to data collection to exploratory data analysis, all of the steps to building and implementing a data science project. It's all taken care of for you. We don't focus as much on the algorithms. This is all about getting a project out the door. Next, we've also open sourced all of our code and all of our examples on GitHub and Kaggle. Those are very easily accessible to everyone, including those people who just maybe want to see those and don't want to pay for the full course. In addition to that, we've included all of the resources that we use to build the course, so you're getting multiple different perspectives on every single concept rather than just our singular voice. I view this course as one of the most valuable things that I put into the world, and I'm excited to hear what you think of it. I've included a discount link in the description for the YouTube video, as well as in the descriptions on all the other podcast platforms. Well, let's change gears. I want to get a little bit into your personal data, right? Your story here. Yeah, I'm interested how you did make that switch or that progression from journalism into the data space and then into the data engineering space.
Sure. This is definitely interrupt me. This is maybe going to be like a long-winded thing because
no, by all means,
my unabridged life story. So I think the best place to start would be journalism school. I went out to Phoenix, Arizona, to Arizona State. I went to the Walter Cronkite School of Journalism and Mass Communication. I say the whole thing because they are very adamant that you say the whole thing. It's a very long school title, but it's a pretty prestigious journalism school in the sense that it really upholds these standards that Walter Cronkite set and the high bar he set with his TV reporting for CBS, back in the 50s, 60s, 70s. And the great thing about that school is that it was very focused on hands-on learning. So from day one, I was in a studio, I was touching cameras, out in the field doing interviews. So it was one of these things that they really threw you into the deep end with the subject matter and helped you like develop the skills you needed to not only graduate, but to get a job and to be marketable. And if they found out that I was working in like data and data engineering, I think they'd be very confused because that is nothing like we covered in school. But yeah, so I finished that up in 2017, 2018. And then I went home to Maryland very briefly. And I took a job as an associate producer for a radio show there, a morning radio show. And I only worked there for a couple of months. I'd interned previously the summer before, so they knew me and they brought me um, on a more sustained basis, I guess. But I only stuck around for a little bit because after that, I got a call from NBC. I totally forgot that I applied to be an intern on the Tonight Show, which is like a very weird thing to forget, but it's one of those things that so many people try to do it that you just have to push it out of your mind and be like, I'm never going to get this thing. But somehow they took a liking to me, and I got hired there in 2017 in the fall, and I was up in New York in the fall of 2017 um, at 30 Rock. And I mean, if you find that interesting, we can dig into that. I'm just trying to give like more of a prologue of leading up to data here, but yeah, so I did that, and then after that internship was over, I think I technically graduated then because I finished coursework a little earlier than my anticipated graduation date, I think, which was 2018. So I finished up in New York. I went home for a couple of months to just kind of like figure out what to do next. And then on a whim, I applied for the Disney College program. So I ended up going down to Orlando, Florida, where I am still hanging out today. And I worked at Disney World for almost a year as a college intern, and then I worked part time after that. And that's a pretty important part of my short journey here because through Disney, I was able to get my master's degree in data science. So that's kind of how this all ties in. I was initially driving boats at Disney. So if you know the Disney parks, I was literally driving some of the boats that go from Magic Kingdom to the various resorts in the area. And so that was definitely an interesting experience because I was a college student essentially. And I think they trained me for like 4 or 5 days. And then they were like, you're signed off to drive a boat. And it wasn't on a track. It wasn't like part of an attraction. These were free floating vessels, and I had like an authentic, like license and stuff. So it was all real. And I mean, you could definitely get into trouble if you didn't know what you were doing. So that was one of those things that I really had to like, again, learn pretty quickly, trial by fire kind of thing. So I did that and then started working for the company on a part-time basis in resorts. And then COVID hit and I was in school through them. Thankfully, they allowed me to continue because I was doing online school for data science. And then, yeah, that was pretty much from there. I started a job search and then I was able to land my role at Forbes today. So, yeah, please.
So I'm really interested in, you were going down this journalism path, you were producing, you were working in this domain. And how did you I'm interested in the story behind the shift to go to Disney, where you effectively were in like a service industry.
Sure.
Was that just like, hey, I'm going to try something new, I want to see this out? Or was it, I'm done with journalism, I want to go this different direction? What was the thought process surrounding those decisions?
Yeah, it was definitely I'm done with journalism kind of thing. I'd been like pretty heavily living and breathing it for a couple of years in school. And I figured out along the way that I didn't want to do conventional reporting. I was much more interested in the production aspect of it, in more of like what my school did really well and continues to do really well is it turns out a like large amount of really great TV reporters. And it also graduates folks who go on to do other great things in the industry, but it really is geared toward TV reporting. And I learned pretty early on that I didn't really want to do that and kind of like bounce around local markets. So I decided I wanted to focus more on, again, like production, tilting toward the entertainment side of it a little bit. So I went and worked for this radio station in Baltimore and then to the Tonight Show. So that was much more of my focus, was kind of like shifting more to the entertainment side of the industry, and then kind of got burnt out from that and didn't end up sticking around New York. So yeah, I was looking for like initially another internship, maybe on the West Coast, but that nothing like really excited me there. So I just knew someone from school had done the Disney College program, and I was like, oh, he really like talked it up and had a great experience. And I didn't know it was really going to be super focused on more of like the customer service side. Like I thought I'd like literally be in a hotel or something, but they put college kids like throughout the company, which is pretty cool, throughout the parks. It's cool and terrifying because the cast members down here, we kind of have like a running joke. Like if you go to Disney after 4 or 5 p.m., like you'll be shocked to know that most of the people running things that you're enjoying, including the rides, are like college kids. So definitely consider that if you're going to the park in the future, that there might be people who are only a couple months into the job operating the big roller coaster. But yeah, that was kind of my mindset. Was I really just wanted something different, and something that would build on a different skill set.
That's awesome. I think I'm generally interested in like, what did you like most about journalism? And, what are the parts that you didn't like? I would imagine like pay probably wasn't your favorite part. But, because, as we talk more, and from what I've heard from other interviews or other friends, like there's a lot of similarities between, the data domain and journalism, in the sense that we're all trying to tell stories.
Yeah.
We want to tell fact-based, objective stories based on some form of quantitative data. And it seems like as a data scientist, maybe less so as a data engineer, but as a data scientist, you get to do that and get paid a lot more money for it in some sense. And the audience is definitely very different. It's not usually as public facing unless you're creating content like I am. But did you seem to find a little bit of that in your coursework when you were learning about data science? Or was there something else that really drew you to the field?
I think, yeah, initially the storytelling aspect of it was pretty exciting. I don't think I really stumbled upon that realization until a couple of semesters in, because initially it was much more fundamental. Like, here's what Python and R are, and like, very basic programmatic and mathematical building blocks. So it took a little while for me to like really get excited by data. And then there was also another period, like in my last semester, that I got some pretty serious senioritis and like wanted to drop out of everything. But that's, I don't know. I don't know how similar that is for a lot of people, but just putting it out there that it does happen. I think that there's just so much value to be able to tell stories, like you said, with objective facts and objective data. I really like the visualization aspect of what we can do with data, creating dashboards, creating visualizations, different things like that. And then also being able to kind of package everything into like a presentation or a white paper. That's something I think I like excelled at in data science school, because again, I came from a reporting background where you created these things called packages, which were are basically like media files for the air. So anything you see on local TV news, we call that a package. It involves a reporter talking in front of the camera, a couple of interviews, and then some B-roll shots. So the kind of like data science equivalent of that is the white paper or presentation you give to your organization, where you kind of break it up into these different sections of like the business problem, the context, how your model performed, that kind of thing. So I was pretty good at figuring out like how to package things. And I feel like I accelerated much more at that than the like math and like building of the models themselves. I was like okay at that, but I was much better at understanding the context and communicating with people.
I mean, I think that that's probably the most important skill, is being able to make your analysis or anything you do useful to another person.
Yeah.
I think that 100% is something that people can index on far better. Just to rewind a little bit, did that play any role into you landing your first job? What was your search like? Especially essentially not coming from a background where you had any real experience other than your master's degree, relevant experience. You obviously did have experience.
Yeah. Well, I think part of the appeal, part of the reason that my now organization really liked my background was because of journalism, and I understood the domain, and I understood like what they were going for and what they use data for, which I think is a very invaluable and pretty subtle aspect of anyone applying for a job. When I initially started applying for jobs, I didn't just apply for any like random data science, data analyst thing. I narrowed it down to the industries I knew and understood, either from an operational perspective or more like domain theoretical knowledge. So I think I ended up going with like hospitality, education, and media. So I really constrained my job search to those three areas because I knew that, if I was working with data and learning new skills and really figuring out like my first role, I wanted it to at least be kind of in a familiar context or familiar territory, versus having to go and like work in like work in ingesting data from like an oil rig or something. I don't know, like something very out of my wheelhouse. So that was something that I think helped the job search initially. I was very fortunate in the sense that my job search was only, I think it was like 2 months. So I basically, just to kind of back up as well, at the time when I finished school, this is something that I've written about and I've also advised people to do, but I kind of took a step back. I graduated in the spring, but I didn't start like applying for jobs in earnest until almost the end of that summer. And this was, I think, 21. So the reason I did that was because I like learned a lesson from journalism school when I left. I left and I realized I didn't have a ton of projects or a ton of, we call them like reels or whatever, or clips, which are pieces of writing that I was like super passionate about. I just had things I kind of made in school. And I found I was facing a similar problem when I left my data science program. I just kind of had these random like Python files and a couple projects I did. But I didn't have too many things that I was super passionate about. So I worked pretty diligently to not only like really focus my job search, but also to make sure I was going through what like different perspective I could present in a project, or try to find some interesting data, or do something differently to like kind of get someone's attention. Because I realized, like you said, I just had a master's degree at that point. I'd done a lot of, pretty relevant coursework in school, and I was writing on Medium. So I was like putting myself out there, but I didn't have that first job yet. So I really worked hard to build this portfolio that demonstrated that I really, had what it took, and I had the coding ability. But not just that, I also knew how to package it and communicate it to an audience, which is such an important part of any data job.
Well, there's so many amazing things to pull from that. I think the first thing is that you were really targeted with your search. I would imagine that made your search so much more efficient. There's so many people that they're so focused on quote unquote jumping into a data career that they forget everything else that they learned. They went to school for chemistry, or they went to school for, some other domain, and they completely leave it behind. In my personal opinion, that's the exact wrong thing to do. It's to leverage the things that you've learned before and combine it with data. That actually makes you significantly more valuable, because you have like an additional skill set where you can bring that subject area expertise. To me, that is like textbook what people should be doing,
Right.
and almost exactly what most people are not doing.
Yeah.
The other side of that, which I think is interesting, is really focusing on the projects and making yourself as different from the crowd as possible. I definitely want you to talk a little bit about some of your projects, because one, I think the topics were fundamentally different from a lot of ones I saw. And two, I also think the way you describe them, especially in blog form, it was very clear that there was value driven from the projects, right? It was like, oh, I want to answer this specific question,
Right.
rather than, oh, I'm just analyzing this data and I hope I find something. I know one of your projects at least was fairly controversial. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about your experience, like finding topics and like making them compelling to employers?
Yeah, of course. So I'm a big proponent of projects in general for the reasons we just discussed. I think that my approach to it, again, like you said, was much more curiosity driven. And this is something that I've told people too. Don't just start with a random data set. Like I hate not just looking or calling out any portfolio or anything I've seen with this, but I've done this as well, where it's a stock data set. And I'm like, oh man, I have to review another Titanic project or Iris or what are the other big ones? I think it's cars.
There's mints, there's cars, there's the penguins.
Yeah.
Data set.
Yeah, let's do a whole hour describing all the stock data sets that come with Python and R packages. But yeah, it's that was my approach, was to start with the question instead of starting with this random data set. So I wanted to service my own curiosity and really tell a story versus just saying here's some data, here's how I chopped it up, here's what the average, the median, all kinds of metrics are. I wanted to lead you through the progression of my thoughts and what I thought was the most important aspect of what's hidden in this data. So one of the ones that I've presented to several potential employers, and my now employer it was, I think it's called the K word, I called it. And it was about the name Karen, because at the time that was pretty controversial. I think it still is a little bit. But back in I don't know, I feel 2019, 2020, maybe it peaked with kind of a lot of public meltdowns after the COVID quarantine and that kind of thing. So I knew that one actually did start in the reverse. I found this, and it is actually a stock data set. It comes with BigQuery and GCP. It's the Social Security Administration data set of names, and it goes back to, say, 1920 something. So it's about 100 years of names data. And this is kind of a different approach. So whereas the other projects, which I'll talk about in a second, I started with a question and found data to service it. I had this data and I knew I wanted to learn a little bit more about BigQuery and about GCP. And again, I knew I didn't just want to be what are the top baby names in, 2020 or whatever, because hundreds of other people had done that. So I ended up just focusing on one name, on the impact of the name Karen. So I pulled data from the Social Security Administration, and I also found supplemental data, which I think is a point I want to emphasize. The power and relevance of not just using one data set for a project, especially an analytic project. You really want to give it that context of being able to demonstrate to an employer that you're pulling multiple data sources, because when you build something, you're loading the multiple tables, or you're pulling from multiple tables. So you just want your work to reflect that generally. The big thing about that project is that I not only pulled data from the Social Security Administration, but also from Google Trends. which is this huge and I think underrated source of not only secondary data. There's a great book. Okay, so it's Seth Stevens Davidwitz, and he wrote "Everybody Lies," and I think there's like a subtitle with that too. Yeah, so it's called "Everybody Lies: Big Data, New Data, and What the Internet Can Tell Us About Who We Really Are." And I had read that, I think, either before or shortly after working on the project, because that book, which includes a ton of really interesting case studies and analyses of just like random cultural concepts and conversations, pulled almost exclusively from Google Trends data. So he was looking at search patterns and what that indicates about psychology and behavior and that kind of thing. So I've very lovingly stolen that approach for my own work to kind of bring greater context. So, like for the KNN project, I wasn't only looking at like who's searching for this, but I wanted to look at how is this being searched. So in Google Trends, I think you can search for a string of text, but then you can also specify whether you want it as like a search term or a keyword. And then I think you can search for pejorative terms too. So that was really interesting, especially with that word, and to see like how people are kind of classifying it as, more of like a pejorative, like bad word now, which is interesting. And then having the background of the Social Security data, it was helpful in showing like, I think the inspiration for that project was the fact that in maybe it was like 2019 or 2020, NPR reported that the name Karen fell something like, I think it was 170 spots down the list of like most popular baby names. And so I wanted to look back and see like when was this most popular? When was it kind of hitting its decline? What were the competitors? That kind of thing. So it was kind of like this competitive analysis, but wrapped in a more approachable context, I guess, and maybe a little more, quote unquote fun for people to read and process versus just saying like, hey, I made up a, fake data for a company or whatever. And here's a dashboard that your eyes are going to go crossed when you look at it because it's too fancy or whatever. Yeah.
I think that insight and relevance are two things that a lot of prospective data scientists don't think about. So that project was taking a pretty benign data source, something that is not that exciting, and transforming it into something that's meaningful. And it's also transforming it into something that has social relevance in this day and age. And if we really think about it, all interviewers, all hiring managers, they're humans. They are prey to like hooks. They are prey to things that are interesting. They want to read stuff that is compelling to them.
Oh yeah.
And so if you have a project that can touch on those things, or it's even, I saw someone who did the Titanic data set, but they framed it like they were an insurance provider trying to insure a new ship.
Oh wow.
Right. To me, that's something that's like, oh, well, it's a new spin on the same thing, on a traditional thing, but that's refreshing. That's different. That's exciting. If someone can do that in your work where, hey, we've been working with this same data for, the last 4 years or similar data, we don't have anything new. Yeah. And this person can come in and spin something exciting and compelling and value driven out of it. That's about as good a skill as you can get. Right. I mean, I still don't recommend people show up with the Titanic data set on their resume at all. But, I have differing opinions on those projects. Like, I think those basic data sets, great for learning. Yeah. Like, you should absolutely do them, but don't share them. There's other projects you can share. And to me, that is so cool that you can transform something that is kind of boring into something exciting. There's like an art in that and a skill you can cultivate within that.
Yeah. And I think it's important in the workplace too. Like, we have meetings, whatever. And I'm in a 100% virtual workplace. So we have meetings that are like, people sharing their screens or slideshows, and more so than in an in-person environment where you might be in a conference room and you can kind of like feed off people's energy or like sense the vibe in the room. You're very much presenting like cold, and you have to like really make sure you're not just being compelling, but concisely conveying information to everybody else in that call. So it doesn't just stop with like doing an interesting project. It's a skill that you have to continue to refine, which is like presenting data in a compelling but coherent way.
Yeah, and I think something that just from listening and from talking to you offline, something that we discussed is how valuable just the written medium is.
Yeah.
Especially in work when you're working silently. Like if you really think about it, a lot of like the majority of my work or the majority of communication I do with other people is through Slack, is through emails or through Discord. Sometimes we have calls, but those are fewer and far between. The actual text that I write. So writing is not dying by any stretch of the imagination. Maybe ChatGPT can help a little bit with that, but to me, it's still something that if you want, you have to convey information clearly around the work that you're doing, and invaluable skill that you can have.
Yeah, I think it's especially in the workplace, and especially in a virtual workplace, communication, in the sense that you just want to be very clear about what you're saying. And like you just touched on, like calls are kind of few and far between. And it's because, I mean, again, even though you're virtual, like people still have full calendars and don't always have time to meet. So being able to convey something very quickly and coherently through, like Slack or even through a shared Google document, these things are important skills to build and develop. So that's something that I keep working on, is like, I want to make sure that I'm still, being, coming across as nice and emphatic and all these things you need to add to writing online to, make it not seem like you are human, but like, convey humanity and emotion in those interactions. But at the same time, you don't want to hit somebody with like a wall of text. So there's a very happy medium between figuring out what exactly they need to know, what needs to go in text form, what can wait maybe for a later call, and how, again, to like really frame it so that you're coming up with a very brief statement of the problem you're facing, and then like maybe a couple bullet points of what you tried. For example, if you're troubleshooting something, or you're trying to push a fix for an error that's happening, and then like just kind of wrapping up what you're saying, and that can be 3 to 5 sentences in a Slack message. Which, by the way, like 3 to 5 sentences can get like pretty overwhelming. So it really does have to be that quick and concise, in my opinion. And again, you want to like be a nice person and say like, hey, like, how are you doing? All that stuff. So that takes up space too.
Yeah, it's really interesting. On the show, we've talked about how you deliver information, when you deliver information, the content of the information, the order of the information, but we haven't necessarily touched on the volume of the information. I think that's such an important insight, that if you want to be able to clearly and effectively communicate, if it's too short, you're not going to be able to deliver enough. If it's too long, people are going to not read the whole thing. Right. And getting the sweet spot right it's a function of practice in some sense. And also, I would imagine the amount of content for the medium is also very important. Like on Twitter, we have a limit. On LinkedIn, there's probably a sweet spot in the amount of information that people will read. On Slack, on email, those things vary. And figuring out what's optimal for your audience, who is your stakeholders or your coworkers, is definitely something everyone should be thinking about as they progress in their careers.
Yeah, and thinking about like not only just like who this person is or who their role is, but like what their day might look like. I mean, I don't think it's too much of a stretch to like maybe take a quick peek at a calendar and say like, oh, this person's in meetings all day, but they have to review this document today. Maybe I shouldn't make it like 10 pages. That's something that I've tried to be more aware of too. Like if I'm sending a quick write up to someone like 2 levels above my boss, I know that this person is like literally all day is meetings for them. So I just want to make sure that I'm getting to the point right away. I'm showing how this is relevant, what actions we can take, and just making sure that I make a very compelling case for whatever buy-in we need. So yeah, that's something that unfortunately school won't really teach you, and is really something you kind of have to hone on the job. I will say, like, doing any kind of writing or LinkedIn post, or just really getting comfortable with how to express yourself in relation to the data you're playing with and doing personal projects with, that'll definitely help you gain that understanding of like where that sweet spot is. But again, it really needs to be refined on the job, I think.
Well, so you know, we've talked a little bit about how you're also doing some writing, you know, not for work. You're writing on Medium. You're really enjoying that platform. I'm interested in your experience there. That's obviously where I came across you to begin with. Right. I think it was on your project on, oh my goodness, what was it? I think it was like on the tragic like porn star like lifespan or something along those lines.
Yeah. That's an interest. I can talk about that real quick if you want.
Yeah. I'm interested in that, as well as just what you've learned from being on that platform and what you like about writing specifically there.
Sure. Yeah. Well, just like a quick summary of the like porn star project. I call it tragedy porn because it is about clever. It's about like the fact that what really inspired this was I was listening to this podcast called The Last Days of August, which was following this like very tragic story of this adult film star, August Ames, who it had a very mysterious death where I think it was unclear whether she like took her own life or whether she was just found dead. But either way, it was like this kind of, it was obviously a very tragic story, but they kept throwing around these different statistics related to folks dying very young in this industry, many of them before 25 or 26. So I felt like, to our point earlier, one, this is a really interesting, like maybe data story here. And two, I can guarantee you no one else is writing about this, or no one else is presenting this. And no one would do this in a job interview, which I found out by doing this in a job interview that there's a reason. By presenting this in a job interview, there's absolutely a reason. You maybe should steer clear of controversial topics before you work somewhere. But the really like core of that experience was a very journalistic intent to look at the larger story unfolding. And I just went back and reread it recently, and I think it does a good job of really contextualizing this problem. And to your point earlier, almost in like a business sense of like, what's the problem? What are the contributing factors? What's kind of like the larger landscape of the industry? So it had all those aspects to it. Again, just kind of packaged in a different way. And yeah, don't do that in a job interview.
Well, I think there's two sides to that. So, I mean, one, there's data in everything, and there's interesting stories to be told with data. Right. I think that in general, we should be telling all stories with data. Yeah. And that's what makes them even more compelling and interesting. I had another guest on the podcast, Kristen, who was using data to improve safety and health of sex workers, which I think is really fascinating.
That is fascinating.
And a very powerful thing. In terms of the job search, I feel like the job market is binary, right? You either land a job or you don't land a job. There's no shades of, oh, I almost got a job. It doesn't matter, right? You either land the job or you don't. And it can pay to take risks with your projects,
Mm.
because if it's more incendiary, more compelling, there's a higher probability that someone actually picks it up.
Right.
And the probability that they pick it up and like it, or they pick it up and put it down, like, I would imagine that you sticking out, even for something like that, would actually increase your chances, because more people are actually putting your resume in the, like, this is at least interesting pile, than just completely disregarding it because it's boring. Well, I think in the actual interview steps might be a little different, but it's a pretty fascinating like equation to think about.
Yeah, I think that might have been like the first interview someone had to start an HR file on someone who didn't even work there. Had to file a complaint. But I will go on record and say I got an offer from that company. I did not go with them, but so it does have a nice ending. But it was, and it's something I thought about recently. And I've written something that I'll publish, pretty soon on this, about working with controversial data sources. Like you said, if the value's there, I think we can, to an extent, all be adults about it. Again, you want to pick your context and pick your battles. Because when I got feedback on that project from the interview, it was the recruiter, whoever my HR contact was. And it wasn't like a crazy backlash. She was just like kind of giving context and more precautionary, and saying like, hey, for the final round, you're going to interview with one of our executives. Maybe don't talk about that. And she was more like looking out for me in that way, versus outright saying like they were uncomfortable or whatever. I think she actually did say like they found it interesting, or like it was an interesting thing. I don't know if that was like being polite or like whatever, but yeah. So I think, like you said, there is a benefit to maybe going out on a different path, or doing something that, again, will get you noticed. But yeah, pick your battles.
Yeah. I think I've described it historically as like a min-max optimization, where there's no benefit of being the average candidate. There's only a benefit in being the top candidate. So, or like the top couple. So if you're in the situation where you could do something that would, at least in some places, like would put you as the top candidate, even if in other places it would put you in the dead last candidate, you're actually still better off than just being the average candidate every time. And I don't know if that's necessarily doing incendiary projects, but it is something to consider in that vein. So obviously, again, I came across those posts on Medium. How did you get started writing there? What's been your onus?
So that was shortly before the job search. Again, I was just kind of like trying to put myself out there. I actually encountered the platform way back in journalism school. I think like we had an assignment where we had to publish something on there, and then just kind of like learn the platform. And that was I think that was in 2016. I kind of regret it, because if I had like done it then, it really was, it continues to be like this really clean, inviting interface for writing. So I was like, man, if I was on it back then, that would have like been really early adoption, especially seeing how much it's grown in recent years. So the great thing about it, I think, is one, the like really friendly user experience. For someone who writes on there, it's super compelling for me to open it up. It's a really nice, clean interface. I can easily format stories, and I can write in a way that it's not just like blocks of text. There's no advertisements. It's an advertisement-free platform, so there's not a lot of noise and visual distractions. And it's also great because they take care of kind of the optimization within the platform. And if you do a couple of things and you tag things correctly, you can find an audience for basically anything. And it's just, in my experience, been a platform where a lot of professionals will go, and a lot of people who, there's a couple different camps of people. There's professionals, there's more marketing people, but there's also some like really cool individual writers who are doing like very different essays and like kind of slice of life things. So you can go on there and just find so many different topics.
I love that aspect of it. I think one of the hardest things with getting started with any form of writing is getting viewership and feedback.
Yeah.
And it seems like Medium is really good at solving that equation. I also think it's really good from a pure marketing perspective for anyone trying to create a brand, is like, rather than starting your own blog and trying to fight for traffic, just leveraging one of these other platforms that leverages search and discovery really well. I mean, that's one thing I love about, I create a lot of content on YouTube. I don't have to do anything. Like YouTube just pushes my content to people that might be interested in it, and I just have to focus on creating. And I think there's a lot of utility in just writing or creating for the sake of it, and that's what I did to start out, and I still do. But it's also quite nice that you don't have to be a marketer as well as just a writer. Those things come along with you if you just create high quality content, which is I think that's like an exciting part. You don't have to feel like you're selling yourself in order to grow as an audience.
And that's
just creating valuable things.
Yeah, and that's something I really try to avoid. I'm not really super active on LinkedIn because it's kind of become much more of like a sell yourself in your side hustle platform. I really am like on Medium more or less for the love of the game. I'm fortunate to have a full-time job that takes care of me and my family here, and everything's good. But so I'm not like doing this for money or anything necessarily. It's just like, it's a really interesting way to not only put ideas out there, but to connect with people, to just like test different kinds of content, especially this year. I'm still focusing on data topics. And I'll do that weekly, but then I'm striving to publish like twice a week now, or maybe even like 3 times a week if I'm feeling it. But going beyond data a little bit to hopefully give people more of a perspective on who I am and different like dimensions of that. I still try to make sure everything is relevant to the reader. And that's something I've learned on Medium as well. Like, something that does really well on Medium isn't just focused on the writer. It's making sure the reader gets a benefit from this. The most obvious example of that is anything data science or programming related, because you can put up a tutorial, and if it's something unique, if it's something needed and something relevant, you'll certainly find an audience for it. But then things like self-help and these different topics like tend to do really well on Medium too, because people go to the platform looking for advice and looking for like people who have reached different degrees of success. So that's been my guiding philosophy as I've kind of learned the platform, is like, I'll write a non-data thing as long as I think it's helpful to people. Like I'm probably going to start writing maybe some things about like traveling, because that's something that is interesting to me. My wife actually, who I met at Disney, by the way, I met her. We were both driving the boats at Disney. So we're still down here, but she's about to go to Disneyland Paris, and she'll be working over there. And I'll be back and forth depending on, making sure I'm maintaining whatever citizen status and whatever I need to maintain in the US. But so writing about, experiences like that, and like going out and living and trying to, again, make sure I'm conveying some kind of value. That's my big takeaway, and really, advice to anyone who wants to get started with sharing any kind of work is just like, make sure this adds something to the conversation rather than creates noise.
Amazing. Well, I will link I will include the link to your Medium page in the description below.
Yeah.
I highly recommend everyone check that out. I've quite enjoyed all of the articles that I've read, so I'm happy to be able to share that with the group here. Zach, those are really all the questions I had. Anything else you want to share? Anything else other people should know? Final words of advice, wisdom, whatever that might be. The platform is yours.
Yeah, I mean, on that note, I guess, I will say, like, this is maybe counter to a lot of things said on podcasts and what people go to podcasts for. But I try not to give like a ton of advice with like experiences because that's really going to vary. And I know that's kind of a cliche. So when someone reaches out to me or encounters my work, I try to like give a very step by step process of like what you need to do if you're trying to get into data or trying to get a job. And what I usually advise people is to one, like we talked about, start with something you're passionate about, an industry, a subject, whatever. Start with that. Find some interesting data. Do something with it. If you're an analyst, make a dashboard. If you're a data science, someone pursuing that, make whatever model you want to do and whatever use case you want to use that for. Data engineer, just make a really clean table or output that someone can use. But I think the key takeaway of anything you're creating for the purpose of trying to get a job, make sure it's actionable, make sure it's a product, make sure it's something you can present and something you're excited to present in an interview. And also find interesting data. Like, I think that's something that doesn't get talked about enough. Don't just read CSV in every line of code and every file you write. Like, go find some APIs, go find some cool web data you want to scrape, JSON, like mix it up, find what you like the kind of data you like to play with. Unstructured data, like there are so many data sources out there and people can do so many creative things with them. And that's kind of exciting being on this other side of like someone who's entered the field and now gets people sending me things, and I'll come across things on Medium that are just super cool and really exciting. So
I love that advice. Well, Zach, thank you so much again for coming on the show, and I look forward to hearing more from you.
yeah, thanks, Ken. Appreciate it.